Alrighty, everybody, we are live.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm Chair Sage Turner. I'd like to welcome you to the June 21st Housing and Community Development Committee meeting. All council members and staff are participating virtually. For those of you out there with us today, welcome. Happy Tuesday. To help our audience follow along, I'll state each section of the agenda aloud. We are streaming live on our virtual engagement hub, which is accessible through the virtual engagement hub link on the front page of the city's website. We also have an option for the public to listen live by phone by dialing 855-925-2801 and entering the code 9791. For today's meeting, we will have the option for people to call in live and comment live during the meeting. To call in and comment live, you use that same number, 855-925-2801 and meeting code 9791. Your phone will be muted and you will hear the meeting live. At this point, callers will hear for more options, please press star. Pressing star 3 will allow callers to continue to listen live and join a speaker queue. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to speak. As a general reminder, please keep on mute unless needing to speak or answering a question. You can raise your hand virtually or visually and I will see you and queue you up. All right, and also please, those of you joining us today, please refrain from using the chat function. We can't always see it and it's kind of been a little distracting. So please just don't use the chat. Right now, I'm going to go through a roll call and introduce all the committee members and staff who are participating virtually today. Council and staff, as I call your name, please give us a quick hello. Vice Mayor Shanika Smith.
Good morning.
Councilwoman Antoinette Mosley.
Good morning.
City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Good morning.
Assistant City Manager is back with us, Rachel Wood.
Good morning.
Welcome back. Community and Economic Development Director Nikki Reed.
Hi, all. Good morning.
Community Development Manager Jonathan Jones.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Affordable Housing Officer, happy to say that ahead of Sasha's name, Affordable Housing Officer Sasha Brzezinski.
Good morning.
All right, thank you, everyone. So for those of you following at home or listening online, we're going to move to section 1 of the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes. We got some action packet. Anybody have questions, concerns, or changes? And if not, may I get a motion?
I move to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Thank you. And I'm going to do a roll call vote. Vice Mayor Smith.
Aye.
Councilwoman Mosley.
Aye.
And myself, aye. So the minutes have been approved. And we're going to move right on into item number 2, the Land Use Incentive Grant for 221 Long Shoals Road, Millstone Management. And I believe, Sasha, are you kicking this off for us? Great. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, and I believe Katie is sharing the presentation. Or I can do that if she might have stepped away. Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks, Katie. Yes, so this is a land use incentive grant request for 221 Long Shoals Road. This is a conditional zoning item that will be coming to City Council in July. So at the end of, in about a month and a half. Next. So the project is for 186 apartments total. And so they are committing 37 apartments or 20% to be affordable for 20 years at 80% or below. They're also bringing some other benefits, which I'll go through in the coming up slides. And in their point total, they qualify for 17 points, or 17 years of taxes paid, or 85 points. Next. This is an all housing project, so it's not a mixed use project. It's just north of Lake Julian. I'll show you that in a second. And as I said, 37 affordable units. The site is about 5.3 acres. They are estimating the taxable value after construction around 3.1 million. And the unit mix for the affordable units is 18 one-bedroom units and 19 studio units. And the units accepting vouchers will be the one-bedroom units and 1 studio. So next. And so here's the location. This same developer brought a project to you all at 66 Long Shoals, so not far away. This is within and I guess I'll say this in a minute, but it's pretty well located. It's very close to TC Roberson. You can see there in the top right. It's pretty close to Ingalls and other community amenities, and within a mile of the Biltmore Town Square. Next. And here's some elevations of the 3 buildings that they're proposing. And you can see Lake Julian there on your right. Next. So for points, they get 20 points for the 20% affordable. They get another 5 points for 10% rental assistance. And so what that means is, 10% of all total units will accept rental assistance. So beyond housing choice vouchers, that could be the veteran assistance vouchers, that could be the HOPWA, which is for folks with AIDS vouchers. There's different kinds of voucher programs. They are proposing to house someone from the homeless by name list for 5 points. As I said, they're in a pretty good location. Biltmore Town Center is called out in the policy as a job center. And they're within a half mile of, Ingalls and high school, middle school. There might even be, I think there's a intermediate school, maybe even an elementary school right there. Energy efficiency, they're proposing solar panels, universal design, and they are building in a non-qualified census tract. And so for folks who may not know, especially in the public who might not know what that means, is they're building somewhere where affordable housing isn't usually built. Like the income, is a little bit higher here. So it's a great location to have more mixed income. So for a total of 85 points. Next.
Sasha, may I ask you a question real quick about that slide?
Sure.
So you mentioned the second bullet point, 10% rental assistance. Do you have any idea of the targets of some of those programs? Is there a range that we can identify? Is it 30 to 60 AMI or any?
Yeah, I've got a slide coming up for that.
Okay.
Next. Oh, so vouchers. So the VASH, which is the Veterans Assistance Vouchers, and the HOPWA, they don't necessarily always target these lower incomes because they're going after specific populations. But obviously those folks need housing. So, but the housing choice vouchers is 50% AMI and below, generally speaking. And so, the household is still paying 30% of their income, but the voucher makes up the difference. And those voucher rates are really good. So it's, the landlord is not really, it's not a loss for them. There's always some hesitancy around vouchers, and Thrive, as we all know, has been working really hard to work against that and get more landlords to accept vouchers. I looked from their data that they gave me. There are currently 100 folks looking with vouchers looking for units. There were another 86 vouchers that weren't assigned. So just kind of out there, not assigned. So about 186 total vouchers, I think, that aren't being used, but 100 households really looking. And that data is from April 2022. Chairman Turner, did you have a question there?
No, I was thinking back to when Mr. Nash was there and he mentioned the number 2,100, and that must be the waiting list to get into housing, not the voucher wait list. But there, I remember him just a couple months ago saying there were 2,100 people waiting to be able to be housed. So this, just a little extra data.
Okay. Yeah, and so as I've heard it said, I remember Paul saying this to me as well, when somebody finds a unit for a voucher, they get housed, but it also frees up a unit behind them in public housing. So we're actually helping 2 households through that process. Next. So just some of the specifics and the finances, and this slide is a lot. I should probably break these up for you. I'm sorry. So currently, they are paying around $13,500 every year in property taxes on vacant land. Under their $3.14 million post-completion value, the annual city tax value would be $126,000. So the difference is $113,000. So that would be the grant they would be given every year for those 17 years. And when you total that up, it's $1.9 million. And then the subsidy is around close to $52,000 per unit, which is below our $80,000 policy limit. And then after year 17, we would start, seeing those benefits back into the city tax coffers. But as you all know, we would still be receiving that $13,000 every year during the LUIGE program or grant program. Next questions. I know that Derek Allen is also here for the project as well.
Sasha, for those listening, can you talk a little bit about the homeless by name list?
Sure. So there are a couple of lists, but there is a list of folks, and Emily is much better at talking about this than I am, but there's a list of folks who are identified who need housing, and it's a range of folks. So there's some folks with a lot of needs that need to be met, and there's some folks that that are a little bit more ready for just to be in a kind of a place like this. And so the idea is that when somebody has a unit, they start working with the service provider. I feel like it's Homeward Bound holding that list and finding the right fit for the person so that, the placement is successful for everybody. And that it's a good fit so that we're not, having problems. So
Thank you. Councilwoman, any questions for Sasha? Any questions for the development team that are with us today? I have one comment, and I know that we're going to be talking more in the near future about, maybe reviewing our Luigi policy and stuff. But one thing that stood out for me in this is the 18 one-bedroom and 19 studio apartments, as opposed to any 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom units. And I'm just highlighting that because I know we continue to see studies that say efficiency in 1-bedroom are the highest need. But it also, when we're not creating any 2-bedroom units, we're just not bolstering family sizes or any kind of larger family unit that might need more than 1 bedroom. And I just kind of want to flag that. And I know maybe when we review policy that can come up, but other than that, I don't have any questions or concerns about this. And if y'all don't, we can move right through it.
Are you ready for a motion?
I am if you are.
Okay. I move to recommend that City Council approve the land use incentive grant application for Millstone Ventures LLC 22221 Long Shoals Road.
Second.
Great. I'm going to move us to a roll call vote. Vice Mayor Smith.
Aye.
Councilwoman Mosley.
Aye.
Myself, aye. All right. Well, thank you for the clear, thorough explanation, Sasha. Derek, thank you for being here. And this item has been completed. For those of you listening at home, we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is number
I do have
3.
an after question.
Okay. Go ahead.
It came late. So since we're serving such a high needs population, what does transportation look like on Long Shoals?
So there is one bus, it's the S6, and it's not great, I'll be honest with you. So it's right now that frequency is over an hour. The plan is to get it to 45-minute frequency. There were funds for that, but I think during the pandemic, funds were moved around to be in the highest need pieces. I don't know, but that is coming, but it isn't funded yet. So it is on the list for more frequent transit, but that's what it looks like there.
Okay, I just wanted to know because it seems like those two populations of people, homeless by name and our veterans, they would probably need a lot of services. So just wondering what the transportation time from that area into town or to their service provider would look like since frequency is low.
Right, it's a good question. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I can make sure I have that answer before we come to council.
Thank you. We're ready to move to the next item? Okay. All right. Item number 3, Strategic Partnership Pilot Grant Program Update. And we're going to have Assistant City Manager Rachel Wood walk us through this. Go ahead, Rachel.
All right. Thank you and good morning. And Katie, you can go ahead and go to the first slide. So this morning, we're going to be discussing a pilot grant program using a portion of the available fund balance of the strategic partnership funds. Next slide, please, Katie. So as a part of this pilot grant program, we're looking at using this funding to address the opportunity gap for school-aged youth with a simplified application and reporting process. Previous slide, please, Katie. previous slide, please, Katie. Katie, if you can move it to the key takeaways slide.
I thought I saw it said Katie's dropped for a second. She might
Okay.
play.
We may be having some network issues.
Let's give her a minute. She's the only one controlling the presentation.
She is.
I imagine I could share my screen.
And I can
Okay,
share.
there we go. There.
Okay,
She's
there we
at the
go.
right slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. So as I was mentioning, the scope of the grant program is to address the opportunity gap for school-aged youth with the simplified application and reporting process. Based on feedback received from today, if we do get direction to move forward, we will advertise those applications for the pilot grant program starting tomorrow, June 22nd through July 12th. We will hear presentations from applicant agencies on July 14th, very much mirroring the process that we followed for ARPA funding. And then we will bring back recommendations on July 19th from the evaluation committee, get some feedback from the Housing and Community Development Committee on if there are any changes that are being recommended, and then ultimately go to City Council on July 26th for their consideration of grant award. Staff is incorporating lessons learned throughout the pilot into a longer term program. So at the conclusion of today's presentation, you're going to hear from Rachel Taylor in Community and Economic Development on that longer term effort to look at a full scale revamp of the strategic partnership process. And Rachel, you can go to Katie, you can go to the next slide. She may still be having some technical difficulties.
Let's give her a minute because she was able to get it before. Oh,
Sure, and it may be easier if I just share the screen.
yeah.
All right, yeah, we've been having some technical difficulties with the lag, so.
Okay.
Sure, so let me pull it up, Katie. Okay, is everyone seeing my screen?
It's not in presentation mode though.
Okay, let's try this again. I'm still learning Google. Okay.
There you go.
All right. So to talk a little bit more about the pilot itself, as I mentioned in the key takeaways, the scope has been narrowed to address the impacts of the opportunity gap, specifically for school-age children and for programming that's both in and out of the classroom. Previous iterations, as we were looking at how we could potentially retool the strategic partnership program, we just discussed potentially establishing a way of building capacity for agencies to potentially be ready for potential CDBG or other federal funding. And some of the feedback we got was that makes the application process a little bit too administratively burdensome for agencies. So for the purposes of this pilot, we are not intending to build capacity with agencies or mirror any sort of federal funding requirements. And so as a result of reducing that requirement that was previously discussed, it's a much simpler application form and much more simplified reporting requirements. We will want to get some feedback from the Housing and Community Development Committee on long term if you want us to look at having some capacity building for agencies. But for the proposed pilot program, it is not intended to build that capacity or mirror any sort of federal process. So as you can see in the attached application form that we're proposing, this is a really simple process that we're looking at for the pilot grant itself. So in terms of kind of the basic requirements that we're looking for, the applications that we're proposing to fund would be a minimum of $20,000 per agency. And we're looking at using half of the available fund balance. So our current fund balance is $711,000 for strategic partnership funds starting at the beginning of fiscal year 2023. And we're looking at making $355,500 of that available to agencies that submit applications for the grant program. So just a quick overview of the timeline for this proposed pilot. We did send notifications to about 75 agencies on June, letting them know that we're going to be making today's presentation to Housing and Community Development, and also letting them know that this funding opportunity was going to be available. So that went out early last week. Today, we're seeking feedback from the Housing and Community Development Committee on anything you may want us to change with the proposed pilot. And assuming we get feedback from you to proceed with posting the application, we will actually advertise the application starting tomorrow. On June 27th, we've scheduled a question and answer session for applicant agencies or agencies that are wanting additional information prior to submitting an application. And then July 12th would be the deadline to actually submit applications for this proposed pilot program. On the 14th, we're going to have Housing and Community Development Committee as well as the Evaluation Committee review the applications, and we will hear presentations from applicant agencies. And then on July 19th, we would come back with recommendations from the Evaluation Committee, discuss scoring from the Housing and Community Development Committee, and ultimately make recommendations on which agencies should receive funding, and then present that to City Council for their consideration on July 26th. So again, we're looking at making sure that these grants have a big enough impact in the community and are not too administratively burdensome on staff. So we did look at a $20,000 minimum to agencies, and then really the only other requirements would be that they are 501c3 and that they're providing programming to address the opportunity gap for school-age children in and outside of the classroom. So getting a little more detailed on that evaluation criteria, we selected 3 key areas from that opportunity toolkit for this pilot program. So a lot of great work has taken place over the last 2 years with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, as well as stakeholder engagement. And so we wanted to use that great work that's happened to inform how we score and evaluate agencies, given the narrowed scope of the Strategic Partnership Pilot Program. And so we're looking at the categories of education, which would focus on literacy, language, early childhood education, and then K-12 vocational and higher education. Community and social context, so that includes family and support networks, social integration and support systems, community engagement, discrimination, and stressors. And then also looking at the neighborhood and physical environment, housing, transportation, access to parks and walkability, safety, and then zip code and geography. So those are going to be some of the key areas as we're developing that scoring criteria that we'll be looking at as we're scoring applicant agencies. So before I transition over to Rachel to talk about our long-term effort, are there specific concerns or feedback on the proposed pilot or the proposed timeline as I've described it? Okay, well then I will turn it over to Rachel Taylor in Community and Economic Development.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So for long-term revisions to the Strategic Partnership Program, we will obviously be looking closely at this pilot program through the entire process and determine whether we need to further narrow the scope of these funds. So we know we want to keep the emphasis on addressing the impacts of the opportunity gap, but we'll reevaluate and see whether we want to further refine that scope. We also want to make sure we are impacting our key populations. So whether we need to make any revisions to increase that impact. So we'll be looking at those evaluation criteria. both through the application process and in the award agreement and follow-up process. So we'll prioritize outcomes and impact, and based on the pilot, refine those as needed. We'll receive feedback from applicants and grantees and further determine whether we need to reduce or change any administrative barriers for the organizations, and determine whether we need to increase the award minimums or whether they are good as we've set them in the pilot. And then we'll continue to monitor and adjust. So we'll incorporate the lessons learned from the pilot, as I mentioned, and continue to engage with stakeholders and subject matter experts to further fine tune the program. So we'll return with a finalized, revised program. And next slide, please. And here's the rough outline for this longer term revision. So through the fall and the winter of 2022, so the remainder of this year, we'll do that program development and provide regular status reports to HCD. And we anticipate throughout that process coming back in the winter, early 2023 to receive further direction from this committee and provide those recommended program revisions. So depending on that feedback, we will begin the implementation process and anticipate the application and award phase in spring of 2023. So with that, I will pause for questions and pass it back to Rachel.
Councilwoman,
Comment. Well, at the onset of this conversation, when we first discussed retooling, we did think about an impact strategy being one that looks at multi-year funding. So I know that's kind of hard to do during a pilot, but as you kind of go through your revision process to determine what long-term impacts we want to have, I think we should look into, I think at the time we were looking into a 3-year funding commitment.
Okay.
any other questions for either Rachel?
And Councilmember Terminer, if I may, as we're closing out with the key takeaways again, I do want to note that there's no formal motion required of the committee today, but we are seeking feedback, particularly direction from you all, if you are comfortable with us advertising the application as proposed in the staff report and using the basic criteria that were described for you today as we're scoring the pilot. Appreciate the feedback on the longer term, but just want to make sure there are no specific concerns regarding the pilot. I know Vice Mayor Smith, you asked the question, could a fiscal agent be used for agencies that do not have nonprofit status? We have gotten a preliminary answer, which is yes. They would just need to, any agency who's submitting the application would need to also include that 501c3 documentation for their fiscal agent with their application packet. But if there are specific questions, again, we do have that session on June 27th to answer questions of the agencies where we can provide greater detail on what that process would look like long term. So just to kind of round it back out, we are recommending a pilot program that would go into effect in the new fiscal year starting July 1 with a narrowed scope to address the opportunity gap for school-aged youth, having a much more simplified application and reporting process than previous strategic partnership funding programs. Assuming we get the direction from you all today, we will advertise those applications tomorrow through July 12th, with applicant agencies making presentations to the Housing and Community Development Committee on July 14th. We'll then take your recommendations and give you feedback from the Evaluation Committee on July 19th, followed by City Council award on July 26th. And then, of course, the lessons learned that we have and different feedback we get from applicant agencies as a result of this pilot will then be folded into that longer term effort that Rachel Taylor described to look at a long-term revamp of the Strategic Partnership Program.
And that's a pretty fast timeline. So kudos and welcome back. Coming back and jumping into it. Any questions or concerns, y'all? Input, feedback, nothing? This has been a big item. We've been talking about when it was going to get started, so happy to see it in front of us. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
Great work from the team, and thank you all for putting all hands on deck to get it done. It looks excellent. I think the community will be proud. They might have some feedback for us all about the timing of it, but given the work that's been done in other areas, as far as like applying for funds, kind of under the same scope, I think it's smooth. I think it'll be well.
Great. Anything from you, Antoinette? All right. Well then, gosh, good luck and get started. That's awesome. Thank you, staff, for your hard work. Expedited as well. And get back to the agenda. We are done with item number 3. You didn't need a motion or anything. You just needed to nod.
No
Okay.
formal motion, just the general direction.
Great. Well, the general direction sounds and looks great. Thank you, everyone. For those of you listening at home, we are finishing up item number 3 on the agenda, and we're going to move into item number 4, which is City Council Committee Work Plans. And Rachel Wood, Assistant City Manager, is going to lead us through this again.
I know I was out for 8 weeks, so I've got to make up for lost time and give you 2 presentations today instead of 1. And getting back to the previous item, I do want to say thank you to the Community and Economic Development Department, as well as to Jamie Matthews in the City Manager's Office for their great work getting the pilot stood up so quickly. It was a great effort and excellent teamwork. So Katie, given the technical issues, I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Okay, so we today are going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is work plans and strategic planning. And as you all may recall, back in March, we had a discussion with you around the City Council's focus area, visions, and strategic priorities. At the March retreat, you all gave us direction on what you wanted your 6 strategic priorities to be. And we discussed at that time at a really preliminary level that we needed to have some reporting mechanisms, potentially via the council committees, to discuss the progress that staff was making on the different programs and initiatives that fell under those broader categories of the City Council strategic priorities. So we're looking at using those strategic priorities ultimately to set work plans for staff, as well as for the City Council committees that will serve as a tool to plan for agenda items and help us look really at the upcoming year, how staff needs to be spending their time, and then ultimately working with advisory boards on how they set their agendas to report back to the City Council committee. So as we'll unpack this a little bit throughout this presentation, but really what we're looking at is formalizing that reporting structure and then just having better advanced planning on what different policy areas you want staff as well as the advisory boards focusing on, so that we can ultimately show how we're making progress towards achieving the goals set forth in your strategic priorities as well as your vision and focus areas. So I won't read through this, but just a quick reminder, you have your vision, which I believe was established in 2018. Along with that vision are some vision focus areas, which have a multi-year, relatively broad scope. And then each year at your City Council retreat, you look at what your strategic priorities are going to be for the upcoming fiscal year. And of course, back in March, you established the 6, which are improve and expand core services, houselessness strategies, equitable and affordable housing stability, neighborhood resilience, reimagining public safety, and reparations. So as we talk about operationalizing, particularly those strategic priorities, we really look at the committee work plan concept as being how would we actually bring the strategic priorities to fruition. So that's really what should be done to actualize those priorities. And then having the work plans for staff and the advisory boards is really how are we going to get that done? So working through those strategies, working through how would a process or program actually come to be, and then reporting back to the committees, and the committees ultimately making that policy recommendation that then the full City Council approves. So kind of talking through this concept a little bit more, as I mentioned, the City Council, of course, reviews and approves their strategic priorities at the annual City Council retreat. And then those priorities are used to inform the city council committee's proposed work plans, as we're kind of envisioning right now. And as we work with you to develop your work plans, we would outline key areas of focus throughout the fiscal year. So, for example, would we be looking at the affordable housing policy, and what specific components of that would we be updating throughout the year? That would be an example of an item on your work plan. And then the committee work plans assign specific projects, programs, and policy areas for the advisory boards to research and work through during the fiscal year. And so this is where we'll be working with you all on what does that reporting mechanism look like, but really more formalizing the relationship between the advisory boards, the council committees, and ultimately the work of staff as well. So the advisory board's agendas under this work plan concept would be centered around the work assigned from city council committees rather than the boards themselves having to figure out what their proposed agenda items should be. And then we would look at that reporting mechanism back to the boards on progress. Then the city council committees would use the feedback from the advisory boards to develop policy recommendations that full city council would ultimately consider. So trying to use a more concrete example as we talk through this concept of work plans is you've obviously got the strategic priority for equitable and affordable housing and stability, which fits very neatly with the Housing and Community Development Committee's charge. So under your committee, you've got a potential work plan topic, as I mentioned earlier, of updating the affordable housing strategies. So one of your assignments to an advisory board might be reviewing the land use incentive grant policy with AHAC. You may have some specific assignments that you make for the homeless initiative advisory board. And so then AHAC would work through potential revisions with staff to the land use incentive grant policy, and on a regular increment, potentially quarterly, report back to the Housing and Community Development Committee on progress. And then once there are some formal recommendations, the committee would consider those, and then ultimately those would go back to full city council for policy consideration and ultimately adoption. So that's kind of the cascade that we're considering of how this could potentially work. And so we're looking at potentially using the Housing and Community Development Committee as a pilot to ultimately replicate this process with all of the council committees and ultimately with all of the advisory boards that feed up to those council committees, just to formalize what is it that we're going to be covering throughout the year, and then how should the advisory boards be spending their time more specifically. So based on feedback we get from you all, staff is proposing that we would prepare a draft work plan that we would bring back to you at your July 19th meeting that would have some of those key policy areas we'd be focusing on throughout the year. Does not mean that there can't be additional items added to the agenda throughout the year, but this is really intended to be that plan so that staff knows how to plan their time accordingly and ultimately work with the advisory boards on how they set their specific agendas as well. So assuming we're able to get at least a start of a work plan in place at that July 19th meeting, then on August 4th, staff plans to present this process and the draft work plan to the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee and go through those specific assignments they receive from the Housing and Community Development Committee at that time. And then, as I mentioned, we're still working through what that reporting structure would look like, but at least on a quarterly basis, we would like for you to hear from AHAC as well as the Homelessness Initiative Advisory Committee on the progress that they're making with the specific assignments that they've received from the Housing and Community Development Committee. And then ultimately, based on feedback from this process, look at rolling this out across all city council committees and their advisory boards to have that specific assignment to the advisory boards, and then ultimately that feedback loop between the advisory boards and the council committees. And so the end goal being that we are able to operationalize the strategic priorities, that staff has clear direction on how we should be spending our time, and so that the advisory boards know that they're working on specific policy areas that are aligned with the work plan and direction of city council committees. So we are looking for feedback from you all today. There's not necessarily a need for a formal motion, but we do want to make sure that there is support for us drafting that proposed work plan and coming back to you all on July 19th with the draft work plan. And so we want to use the City Council's committees to really develop those work plans as we look at how are council strategic priorities, how are we moving the needle in those specific priority areas. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and answer any questions that you have.
City Manager, Deborah, go ahead.
I guess the only thing that I would add is that we are going to be discussing kind of this broad overview with the rest of the council committees. But we would be requesting that we kind of use you all as the guinea pig for, developing the work programs and work plans, and moving forward and kind of express lessons learned so that the other committees can learn from the experience. And this is actually mirroring, I think, what we are trying to establish with the boards and commissions relook to make sure that we're all focusing on your priorities and that we are collaboratively staff, the boards, council. We're in lockstep. We're working on the same things and hopefully accomplishing mutual goals and having mutual impact on the community, which is most important.
Agreed. I really like this format and plan. I know I hear from some committees just, throughout boards and committees, not just housing related, that, what do you want us working on and how can we help? How can we help? And in the absence of having clear things to work on, they tend to dream up their own, which can complicate matters because it may not be one of our focuses or something that may struggle to, get some leg room and groundwork done. And then they feel like they're not helping. So I think this is great. I think this is a great move. And since housing is one of our top priorities for this upcoming year, this is a great committee to run with this kind of model. Happy to be a model for other boards and committees. But I think getting a work plan and, I think throughout recent meetings, we've been kind of throwing out ideas like just earlier when we reviewed a Luigi and about the family size units. And some of that is ready to be discussed and reviewed. And I think engaging AHAC on some of that will be really helpful. They have a lot of great brains on the topic, and I think they'll appreciate being involved and being able to have some input. Ladies, do you have any other thoughts or concerns or comments about this kind of structure? When we did a little check-in ahead of this meeting, which I do as chair, we talked about whether or not we wanted to kind of brainstorm some ideas and help staff kind of from a starting place or just throw out ideas to maybe jot some notes down. I don't know if anybody wants to do that. I know various topics have come up throughout our meetings and I've been kind of keeping notes the whole time. So I know I have a couple pages of things that have been brought up in meetings. I'm happy to forward that to staff. But Rachel, Deborah, how can we best help? I know staff are going to kind of run with this and say, here's some things we can tackle, but do you also want to hear from this council committee about some things like ideas that put on the table, put on the list to review and consider?
Absolutely, we want to hear from the committee. So we will, as I mentioned in the presentation, be coming back on the 19th. But our goal and hope is that we're able to get at least some semblance of a work plan established at that meeting. So if we're able to get some of those topics from you in advance so that we can fold those in and kind of think through when might make sense during the fiscal year to discuss those items, it would be really helpful to hear in advance, just so that we can have that baked in as part of what you react to at your meeting on the 19th.
Great. And I think the reason for this is we truly have to look at order of magnitude of the assignments and staff resources. And that particularly with community and economic development may be a little bit challenging because they just have a lot on their work plan and program, but having committees to help think through some things will certainly lighten the load for CED, but it's still a concern of mine, and I'm sure it's a concern of Nikki's as well, is that we be reasonable and mindful of our staff challenges.
Agreed, and extra thankful to have Rachel back and Sasha at the helm now.
Well, and this is a really helpful way, just to Deborah's point, for us to test some assumptions on how Nikki and her team should be spending their time as well. So Nikki, of course, is developing her departmental work plan. Several of her departmental work plans are on what we're calling our organizational work plan, which are some of those broader policy areas. But we want to make sure that Nikki's focusing on what you as a committee view as the top priority things in that order. And so this is a great way to facilitate that dialogue. Where it's really hard, if we were to discuss this with the full city council, it's really hard to have those deeper dive conversations with the full city council. So this really is a great way to get that feedback on how we as staff should be spending our time.
That's great. And I recall from when I was the chair of AHAC, we would actually create a spreadsheet of all the 12 months of that fiscal year and the topics we were assigning to ourselves to review and just kind of tag along with it. So I think we did that so that the community could also know ahead of time what we were about to discuss, so they'd have ample input as well. But those work plans, I think we did at Downtown Commission as well. And it was helpful to have throughout the year, because if we did get off track, we'd just look back and say, hey, this isn't even on the list. Let's tackle what's in front of us first. And I know I'm just going to rattle off a few things that keep coming up. Obviously, reviewing Luigi. I continually hear fellow councilwomen talking about the idea of using a community benefits table similar to the hotel moratoriums for larger conditional use or conditional zoned housing projects. I know we talked a little bit about some of that 49 unit cutoff has come up and whether or not it should be a higher number of units that triggers council approval. Yeah, there's just been a few that continually come up. And I think when we see issues repeatedly, that can indicate that there's a problem with the code or the policy that needs a little revision. Councilwoman Mosley, go ahead.
Thanks. And I'd also be interested in following up with the equity discussion we began last year as it relates to developers, but also equitable, affordable housing, meaning ways where lower AMIs can be reached, even if it means increasing other AMIs. So I'd be very interested in 60%, 50%, even if it meant increasing to 120, ways we can do that. And also, wondering if there's a way to align what we're doing with requests from the Reparations Commission. I'd be interested in those.
Yeah, on my list is, are there legal avenues? We get stuck around race specifically and fair housing practices. And I'm wondering if there are ways, a big legal question, when in the past municipalities or governments have taken real estate, are there any legal avenues to then look to those for replacement or repairing that loss of real estate, as regardless, like not introducing race, just people who had their property taken? I'm just curious if other cities have encountered anything like that. So that's always been on my list, and is similar to what you're getting at, Antoinette. Also, you mentioned if the lower AMIs, if you get deeper and you brought in the 120, I'm consistently hearing from our workforce, like the folks that just they're over 80 AMI, but they're nowhere near able to afford market rate. So they're feeling left out. And I hear this from the service industry. I know that AIR is organized and is trying to create their own solutions to affordable housing for their workforce. So I'm curious about that 100 to 120 AMI as well. Go ahead, Antoinette.
Or I'd also be interested in the potential for home ownership opportunities, if that can be married with lower AMIs. For example, if we have a developer building 100 units, if the developer would offer ownership opportunities, maybe in partnership with the housing authorities, family self-sufficiency. I would just love to know if that's a pipe dream or in fact doable. Things like that, alternate approaches for home ownerships for folks at the lower AMI levels as well.
Yeah. And Vice Mayor, you and I had a conversation recently, and I think it came up with our last meeting when we were reviewing the micro units. So concern about that neighborhood and the impact of these large housing developments coming. So to me, preservation and protection of housing is also a means of creating and sustaining affordability. So there was talk of, do we need to look at buffers in some of these zones or graduated zoning so that these neighborhoods are not further impacted or could be spared some gentrification? So that kind of came up. One of the interesting ones on my list that I don't know, it's not really us, but when I think about HACA and the year requirement to live in public housing before you can get a housing choice voucher, which is the one that lets you go out in the community, I'm wondering if that's their program or if that's a guideline they must follow, or if we can somehow talk to them about that year. And Deborah, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Sure. And this is really in response to Councilmember Mosley's concern about homeownership. One of the things that we hope as part of the budget approval process is an assessment of the missing middle, which is housing. Right now we're getting, these big projects or nothing at all. And I think this assessment of that middle housing where you have triplexes, duplexes, quads, those are the things that might get us a little closer to homeownership, including small condos. So that is a part of what we think is critical that we take a look at. And we've had a number of other consultants and assessments that have said you need to look at this missing middle as part of your toolbox of opportunities to enhance affordable housing.
And we set aside in our budget $85,000 to complete that study. I assume it includes ADUs as well, because for a long time there was been on our work plan at AHAC was an ADU guideline document. It just never got tackled. There's always so much going on. But one of the things that has repeatedly come up is the idea of 2 ADUs by right, because there's a little kind of trick when you start doing 3 units in one building. There's fire and life safety increases in cost. But if you were a house with the basement apartment and it had a garage apartment, which would be 2 ADUs, you do not have those same life safety triggers. So it's a way to get 3 units on a property without as much cost. So the 2 ADUs by right has come up over the years. That might be worth looking into. There was always talking some other cities, much larger cities than Asheville, are taking on just kind of eliminating single family zoning altogether. I wouldn't say Asheville's quite ready for that, but we may be able to look at upzoning some major corridors, eliminating single family zoning within like a half mile of our known corridors or something, some range of distance. But yeah, all good topics. And I imagine staff have their own list and that this could be a pretty long list. And I get the point here is to assess what we can actually take on, what actually seems feasible, and not taking on too much. And maybe it's a work plan that carries over years, or is just a list that we're tackling.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Chairperson Turner, is that this can be a 1 or 2 year work program, and we'd have to take all of these suggestions and assess what's the critical path and what's doable in the first fiscal year. But it may make a lot of sense for us to have more than less, such that committees can start working on things ahead of time. And that there can be some idea of a North Star or horizon for both staff and the committees.
Right.
And we don't have to do this every year.
Right. And, some of that, like with Luigi, some of my notes say, can we look at whether or not if a project meets the policy, checks all the boxes, why are all the committees having to review it, and why is it having to go all the way to council? So can we, some of these things might help us reduce our workload. If we get Luigi to a place it can just be implemented without review, and staff report, then some of that will save us time and expedite projects. So yeah, just some ideas on the table. I guess if we have, I'm sorry, go ahead, Vice Mayor.
I have a question about the process. Before the committee comes to a formal recommendation about the assignment, will we kick it back to the advisory board for them to kind of review? And maybe they will have some suggestions to the committee that we didn't think about, but we have a 2-way communication.
Absolutely.
Rachel.
Yeah, that's using the advisory boards as they were intended to be used. And so that's definitely what we envision is what you just described, Vice Mayor, is having that two-way conversation with them before ultimately the committee making a recommendation that full city council considers.
That's great. Exciting.
My only other concern, and I know this is a pilot and we're just kind of road mapping what can be possible, but when it comes to the scope of this committee's work, you know, it can touch the neighborhood advisory board. It can touch human relations, you know, so I'm just trying to figure out if we do have other advisory groups with community development and housing interests, then how are we going to measure our work and whose work gets what priority in this conversation? I think that is an ongoing concern with restructuring. And will the advisory boards who might have less reputation or popularity, will they be able to get the same consideration and same time as other committees, advisory boards, rather?
So really mapping, you know, which boards and committees and how that process is fair. Yeah. Agree.
Right. And that's where having a work plan for all of the committees is going to be really helpful so that we can then see what's the full landscape. Because to your point, Vice Mayor, none of the advisory board's work is going to be mutually exclusive and only touch one city council committee. It's going to likely touch multiple city council committees. And so figuring out on a topic basis what makes sense to report back to this committee versus planning and economic development, for example, is something that we're going to have to work through over the next year, because it might be that multiple council committees are involved, or at least want to have regular status updates on the progress of key policy areas.
That's great. I'm excited. Any other feedback for staff? That's great. Well, that is an exciting discussion. Thank you for coming back so quickly and ready. Rachel, you're on it. We're thrilled. So that wraps item number 4 on our agenda. And the only item we have left is item 5, public comment. Did we have any public comments, or I know we didn't have any ahead of time. Do we have anyone on the phone?
No, we do not.
Okay, I guess we satisfied every answer, every question for all the thousands of people. And if there are no other comments or anything, I think we can adjourn. Is everyone good? Okay. Thank you, staff, for your time this morning and such good work. And with that, we are adjourned. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.